The alien armada hovered over the burning human colony, their warships casting long shadows over the crumbling ruins below. Smoke curled into space, rising from the shattered remains of what had once been a thriving settlement. The battle had been short, almost laughably so. The humans had put up a fight, but against the sheer numbers and firepower of the Xarlock fleet, their resistance had been meaningless. Now, the Xarlock commanders watched the last of the human distress signals fade into silence, convinced that this was nothing more than another easy victory. Admiral Vostek stood on the bridge of his flagship, a massive dreadnought lined with plasma cannons and reinforced armor. His scaled fingers drummed against the control panel as he gazed at the flickering images of destruction below. Another human world, another reminder of how weak they truly were. He turned to his officers, his voice filled with contempt. This was their best effort. He sneered. Pathetic. Their fleets are scattered, their colonies defenseless. Soon, Earth itself will fall. Laughter rippled through the bridge. The war was going exactly as planned. The Xarlock had always known that humanity was nothing more than a minor species, loud and defiant but ultimately fragile. Their technology was outdated, their military strategy simplistic. There was no challenge, no real resistance. The fleet had barely lost a handful of ships in this entire campaign. But then, something changed. An alarm shrieked across the command deck. Officers scrambled to their stations, their confident expressions twisting into confusion. A bright light flared on the sensor display. Something massive approaching from deep space. At first, it looked like a glitch, an error in the system. But as the readings stabilized, the truth became undeniable. A ship was coming. A human ship. Vostek narrowed his eyes, leaning closer to the display. That didn't make sense. The humans had no warships in this sector. Their fleets had already been crushed. But this vessel was enormous, larger than any human craft that Xarlock had ever encountered. It moved with impossible speed, breaking every known rule of physics. No warp signature, no hyperspace wake, just a silent approach, cutting through the void like a predator closing in on its prey. The bridge fell silent as the mysterious ship drew closer. Its design was unlike anything the aliens had seen before. Sleek, angular, and impossibly advanced, it glowed with an eerie blue energy that seemed to distort the very fabric of space around it. The Xarlock fleet adjusted their weapons, preparing to fire, but the ship did not slow. It did not respond to hails. It did not send any transmissions. Then, in an instant, it arrived. The ship dropped out of its impossible travel state and materialized directly in the center of the Xarlock armada. The sheer size of it dwarfed even the largest dreadnoughts in the fleet. Its hull shimmered with a strange energy field, pulsing like a living thing. The human insignia was barely visible, etched into the metal in a way that made it look ancient and unbreakable. For the first time in his life, Vostek felt something unfamiliar claw at his mind. Not anger, not irritation. Something colder, something heavier. Fear. A transmission came through. A single message, played across every Xarlock vessel simultaneously. It was not a warning. It was not a request. It was a statement. Run, or be erased. For a moment, no one moved. The arrogance that had filled the bridge moments ago had vanished. The officers stared at their screens, at each other, at their admiral, waiting for orders, waiting for someone to make sense of what was happening. Vostek bared his fangs. This was absurd. No matter how large or advanced this human warship was, it was still just one ship. The Xarlock fleet numbered in the thousands. Fire, he growled. The fleet unleashed a devastating barrage of plasma and kinetic rounds, a storm of destruction that had shattered entire planets before. Explosions rippled through space, engulfing the human battleship in a blinding inferno. The bridge filled with cheers, officers shouting in triumph. But Vostek did not celebrate. Something was wrong. As the fire cleared, the ship remained untouched. The energy around it pulsed again, the glow intensifying. The alien officers stared in stunned silence as their sensors revealed the horrifying truth. The weapons hadn't missed. The projectiles hadn't been deflected. They had simply vanished. Vostek's claws dug into the metal railing. This was impossible. Even the most advanced shields could not absorb that kind of firepower. Yet the ship floated there, silent, watching. It had not moved. It had not retaliated. It did not need to. Then, finally, it acted. Without warning, the battleship flickered, moving faster than any Xarloc ship could track. One of their heavy cruisers, a vessel the size of a city, simply blinked out of existence. No explosion, no debris. Just gone. Panic exploded across the fleet. Ships veered off course, captains screaming for evasive maneuvers. It didn't matter. The human ship moved again, a blur of light and death. Another ship disappeared, then another. On the bridge, Vostek struggled to stay in control. "Fall back. Regroup," he barked, but his voice was lost in the chaos. That Xarloc fleet, once an unstoppable force, was unraveling before his eyes. The ship did not stop. It moved methodically, erasing ships one by one, as if it were toying with them. The Xarloc had never known fear, never known helplessness. Now, they knew both. Then, the ship turned toward Vostek's flagship. The admiral felt his throat tighten as the glowing energy surrounding the ship grew stronger, like a storm preparing to unleash its final devastating strike. "Open a channel," he shouted. "Tell them we surrender." The ship gave no response. The last thing Admiral Vostek saw before darkness consumed his world was the battleship's final movement, a flicker of light, an impossible presence descending upon his ship like the hand of an angry god. Then silence. The silence after the destruction of the Xarloc flagship did not last long. Across the remaining alien fleet, panic turned into chaos. Thousands of ships, once an unstoppable force, were now scattered and leaderless. The command structure had collapsed the moment Admiral Vostek's vessel disappeared, erased from existence without even a trace of debris. The Xarloc warriors, creatures bred for conquest and domination, had never faced anything like this. For the first time in their history, they were not the hunters. They were the hunted. Aboard one of the surviving battlecruisers, Captain Jalvor clutched the edges of his console, his hands trembling. He had seen countless battles, fought in wars that had spanned generations. But this was something else. The human battleship, if it could even be called that, moved like a specter through the fleet, appearing and disappearing faster than their sensors could track. Every time it reappeared, another ship was lost. Not destroyed, not damaged. Erased. Jalvor's officers screamed for orders, but his mind was blank. How could he command a battle when the enemy did not even seem to be bound by the same laws of reality? They had fired everything they had: plasma cannons, railguns, high-yield antimatter warheads, and nothing had so much as scratched the ship. Worse, the human vessel had not yet retaliated in full. It was picking them apart slowly, systematically. Then, another alarm blared through the bridge. The ship was moving again. It flickered into existence beside a Xarloc dreadnought, one of the largest warships in the fleet. The dreadnought's shields flared, its weapons firing desperately in every direction, but the attack simply ceased to exist. The moment the plasma bolts left the cannons, they vanished as if they had never been fired at all. The battleship did not fire a single shot. It did not need to. The dreadnought began to fold in on itself, as though an invisible force had wrapped around it. Metal screamed. Hull plating bent and crumpled. The massive warship, once a symbol of Xarloc supremacy, collapsed into nothing. One moment it was there, then it wasn't. The crew of every remaining ship stared in stunned, horrified silence. This was not war. This was extermination. Jalvor's blood ran cold as a whisper echoed through every communication channel, reaching every ship at once. "You were warned." It was the same voice from before. Calm, emotionless. It did not sound like an admiral or a soldier. It did not sound like a demand. It simply was. Jalvor turned to his officers. Break formation. All ships, retreat to hyperspace. Now. But it was too late. The ship moved. A streak of blue light cut across space, and 10 Sarlacc ships vanished in an instant. No debris. No explosions. Just gone. Panic surged through the fleet. Warships turned and fired blindly, hoping that sheer volume would make a difference. It did not. The human ship phased between attacks, its movements impossible to track. It was everywhere and nowhere. On another command vessel, General Croven tried desperately to make sense of what was happening. He slammed his fist against the console. What kind of weapon is this? What technology are they using? The scientists scrambled through data, their eyes wide with disbelief. It's not a weapon, General. One of them whispered. It's something else. Croven's rage turned to dread. Something else. That was the only explanation. The ship did not fight like a machine of war. It fought like a force of nature, like the very fabric of reality itself had been bent to its will. More ships were vanishing. Entire squadrons disappeared without a trace. The Sarlacc, once the terror of the stars, were running like frightened animals. Jalvor clenched his jaw, his mind racing. They had to escape. There was no winning this battle. He slammed the emergency beacon on his console. All ships, activate hyperspace drives. Retreat to the Council homeworld. We must warn them. The surviving ships obeyed, their engines roaring to life as they prepared to jump. The hyperspace field began forming, a swirling vortex of energy pulling them toward safety. Jalvor allowed himself a single moment of relief. Then the human battleship appeared directly in front of them. Every sensor on his ship screamed with warnings. The ship had moved faster than any hyperspace engine, faster than anything known to exist. It was waiting for them. The hyperspace field began to destabilize. Something was interfering with it. Jalvor's heart pounded in his chest. If they could not jump, they were doomed. His comms officer gasped. Captain, we are being hailed. Jalvor's throat went dry. The humans were speaking to them. For the first time, they were speaking to them directly. Put it through, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The screen flickered to life. For the first time, they saw who they were fighting. A single human appeared on the screen, clad in a dark uniform, eyes like burning stars. Their expression was unreadable, cold and detached. The human spoke. The Sarlacc Empire has chosen war against humanity. Jalvor tried to speak, tried to plead, but no sound left his throat. The human's gaze did not waver. You will not survive. The transmission cut out. The battleship moved. And the Sarlacc fleet began to die. Jalvor could do nothing but watch as the human battleship tore through the fleet like a god of death. It did not fire conventional weapons. It did not launch missiles or beams of energy. It simply moved. And every time it did, another Sarlacc ship was erased from existence. No wreckage, no debris. Just nothingness where a warship had once been. On the bridge of his battered command vessel, Jalvor gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly that his claws cut into the metal. His officers were in chaos. Some shouted for orders. Others stared at their screens in silent horror, unable to process what was happening. The Sarlacc had never been in this position before. They had never known fear. And now, it consumed them. The human battleship was playing with them. It could have wiped them all out instantly. Jalvor was certain of that now. But it wasn't. It was allowing them to see, to understand their fate before delivering the final blow. This wasn't just a battle. This was a warning. A nearby destroyer broke formation and turned to flee at maximum speed, its thrusters burning with desperation. It never made it. The human ship flickered, reappearing beside it in an instant. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, without a sound, the destroyer collapsed inward. It was like space itself had decided the ship did not belong. One moment, It existed. The next, it did not. Jalvor's hands trembled. This was not how wars were fought. The Exarlock had waged countless battles across the stars. They had encountered species that resisted, some even strong enough to slow their expansion. But this was something beyond war. This was a force beyond their comprehension. The human ship had still not taken a single hit. Every plasma bolt, every missile, every high-energy cannon blast simply vanished before reaching its hull. Jalvor had never believed in myths, in old stories of ancient terrors that lurked in the dark spaces of the universe. But now he found himself praying that this thing was just a ship, that it wasn't something far, far worse. "Sir," a trembling voice broke the silence on the bridge. "They're hailing us again." Jalvor swallowed hard. "Put it through," he whispered. The screen flickered. The same human appeared. The same cold, unshaken stare. There was no rage in their expression, no hatred, only the calm certainty of someone delivering an inevitable truth. The human spoke. "Your empire is over." Jalvor's throat tightened. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to claim that the Exarlock would rebuild, that they would return stronger. But the words would not come, because he knew the truth. The human was right. The empire that had ruled for centuries, that had crushed countless species beneath its war fleets, was coming to an end. And humanity, this species they had once considered weak, was its executioner. The human battleship moved again, and the killing resumed. The Exarlock fleet was no longer fighting. It was running. For the first time in their long history of conquest, the mighty warlords of the Exarlock were reduced to prey. Their remaining ships scattered in all directions, breaking formation, desperate to escape the slaughter. There was no strategy now, only panic. Jalvor could barely breathe. His fleet, once an unstoppable force, was being annihilated without resistance. No weapon in their arsenal had even touched the human battleship. Every attempt at an attack had been ignored, nullified, or erased from existence. He forced himself to speak. "Activate the hyperdrive. Get us out of here." His officers scrambled, their hands flying over controls, eyes wide with terror. The ship's engines roared to life, the familiar hum of hyperspace energy building. Escape was the only option. A dozen other surviving warships did the same, their engines burning with frantic energy as they attempted to flee the battlefield. The battle was lost. The war was lost. But maybe, just maybe, some of them could survive long enough to warn the High Council. The bridge lights flickered. Then every alarm in the ship began screaming at once. "Captain," one of his officers choked out, "something is interfering with the hyperdrive. The calculations error." He stopped, his hands frozen over his console. His eyes widened. No, this isn't possible. Jalvor felt his blood turn to ice. The human battleship had moved again. It was directly in front of them. A single Exarlock cruiser, just ahead of Jalvor's ship, vanished. Not destroyed, not damaged, simply removed from reality. Jalvor's throat tightened. They weren't just fighting a ship. They were fighting something outside of known physics. The comms crackled to life. The human was calling them. Jalvor didn't want to answer. He wanted to cut the transmission, to shut his eyes and pretend this wasn't happening. But his trembling hand moved to the console, and before he could stop himself, he accepted. The screen flickered. The same human. The same unshaken, unrelenting stare. Jalvor's voice came out in a hoarse whisper. "Why?" The human did not blink, did not show even a flicker of emotion. "Because you chose war." Jalvor's heart pounded. We didn't know. We thought humanity was weak. We thought. You thought wrong." Silence. Jalvor clenched his jaw. His mind screamed at him to bargain, to beg, to find some way out. "Please," he said, barely more than a whisper. "Spare us." The human didn't answer immediately. But when they spoke, their voice was cold, final. "There will be no mercy." The transmission cut. Jalvor barely had time to react before the human battleship moved, and a Xarlock fleet began to die. "You said." Jalvor watched in helpless terror as his fleet was torn apart. There was no battle anymore, only execution. The human warship did not fire conventional weapons. It did not launch missiles. It did not need to. Every time it moved, a Xarlock ship simply ceased to exist. No wreckage, no explosion, just absence. His crew was silent now. There were no more frantic calls for orders, no more desperate attempts to fire back. Every officer on the bridge simply stared at their screens, waiting for the inevitable. Jalvor's hands trembled as he gripped the armrests of his chair. He had once commanded a fleet powerful enough to bring entire civilizations to their knees. Now, he couldn't even save himself. The human ship flickered again. A heavy cruiser, a vessel that had crushed dozens of worlds, was next. It blinked out of existence without a sound. Jalvor turned his gaze toward his own reflection in the darkened screen before him. His eyes were wide, his skin pale. Was this what all those other species had felt when the Xarlock came for them? Was this what fear truly was? The comms crackled. He already knew who it was. He already knew what they would say. But still, he accepted the transmission. The human appeared once more, unshaken, unstoppable, unforgiving. "You should have surrendered when you had the chance." Jalvor's breath hitched. We didn't know." His voice was barely a whisper. "We didn't know humanity was like this." The human tilted their head slightly. "You never asked." Jalvor had no response, because it was true. The Xarlock had never considered diplomacy with humans. They had assumed humanity was weak, just another species to conquer. They had sent fleets, burned colonies, and slaughtered civilians without a second thought. And now, they were paying the price. His claws dug into his armrests. "What do you want from us?" The human's expression did not change. "Nothing." Jalvor blinked. Then, "This is not a negotiation." The transmission cut. Jalvor exhaled a shaky breath. He turned to his crew. "Prepare all escape pods," he ordered, though his voice barely carried weight. "Save whoever you can." One of his officers looked at him with hollow eyes. "There's nowhere to run, sir." Jalvor opened his mouth, but stopped. The officer was right. The human ship moved again, and everything began to end. "You said." Jalvor had never understood true helplessness until this moment. For all his years as a warlord, for all the battles he had won, he had never once imagined a scenario where victory was impossible, where fighting was meaningless. But now, as he sat on his dying bridge, surrounded by the shattered remnants of his once mighty fleet, he understood. The Xarlock were finished. The human battleship had not taken a single scratch. Every attempt to fight, every desperate escape maneuver, every trick they had relied on for centuries, none of it mattered. And now, it was his ship's turn. The vessel trembled violently as something unseen wrapped around it. There was no explosion, no impact, just a sensation of being unmade. His crew screamed as their consoles flickered, their weapons ceased functioning, and their engines failed without reason. Jalvor's breathing was ragged. He turned to his weapons officer. One last shot. The officer hesitated, then obeyed. With shaking hands, he fired the ship's main cannon, the most powerful weapon that Xarlock had ever built. The shot never landed. The energy blast simply vanished. Jalvor swallowed hard. His entire body felt numb. They were not fighting a war anymore. They were witnessing their extinction. The comms flickered once more. He did not want to answer, but he had no choice. The human appeared, cold, unshaken, inevitable. Jalvor forced himself to speak. "What are you?" For the first time, the human's expression shifted, just slightly. "The consequence of your arrogance." Jalvor closed his eyes. He had no words left, no excuses, no pleas. The human warship moved one final time. And then, silence. You said. Jalvor opened his eyes. He expected death. He was ready for it. But instead, he was still here. His ship was intact. His body had not been erased from existence. Confusion filled his mind. Why had they stopped? The human ship remained before him, silent, unmoving. The battlefield that had once held a proud Sarlacc fleet was now empty. Only broken remnants drifting in the void. His ship was the last one left. A final message appeared on his screen. The humans stood there, their expression unchanged. Their eyes, however, held something far more terrifying than hatred. Indifference. You are the last witness, the human said, their voice calm. You will carry this story back to your people, and they will understand. Jalvor's throat tightened. His mind screamed at him to ask, why spare him? Why let him live? But deep down, he already knew. It was not mercy. It was a warning. The screen went dark. The human battleship turned away, fading into the blackness of space. It did not gloat. It did not celebrate. It did not even acknowledge him anymore. To them, he was already dead. Jalvor let out a shaky breath. He had survived. But for the first time in his life, he wished he hadn't. Because now he had to return home. And when he did, he would have to look his leaders in the eye and tell them the truth. The Sarlacc Empire was no longer the hunter. Humanity was.